In 2024, China spent approximately 940 billion US dollars on clean energy. That is a single-year figure. And for context, total global investment in fossil fuels that year was around $1.12 trillion. China's clean energy spending in one country in 1 year came close to matching what the entire world spent on oil, gas, and coal combined. Also, in 2024, China installed 360 gigawatts of new wind and solar capacity. More than half of every new wind turbine and solar panel added to the global grid that year went into China. Those numbers are large enough that they tend to produce one of two reactions. They are either weaponized as proof of concluded energy transition or dismissed as superficial metrics. This episode is going to resist both reactions. Instead, we are going to trace how China got to these numbers, what the new 15th five-year plan actually says about where the system goes next, and where the arc could diverge from its current trajectory. The 2035 target buried in the plan's guidance documents is the endpoint worth holding in mind throughout. Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. Phase 1 of China's renewable story begins not with gigawatts, but with a law. In 2005, China passed the Renewable Energy Law, a framework that established the legal basis for feed-in tariffs, grid connection obligations, and public finance support for wind and solar projects. Think of a feed-in tariff as a guaranteed purchase price. The grid is legally required to buy your electricity at a fixed rate for a set period, removing the revenue uncertainty that would otherwise make early-stage projects unfinanceable. The funding mechanism was a renewable energy surcharge added to the industrial electricity bills. In other words, Chinese industry paid a small premium on every kilowatt hour consumed, and that premium funded the early wind and solar pipeline. At the same time, China participated in a clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, an international scheme that allowed developed countries to offset emissions by financing clean energy projects in developing countries. Chinese wind projects were among the largest recipients of CDM credits. Solar was first deployed at meaningful scale through rural electrification programs, bringing power to off-grid villages before grid-scale solar made economic sense. A 2007 mid to long-term renewable energy development plan set the formal targets and sectoral roadmaps. The state was not merely permitting an asset class, it was underwriting an entire industrial ecosystem across the financial, regulatory, and procurement axes. What distinguished this phase from similar policy efforts in other countries was the link to manufacturing. Subsidies and guaranteed prices created domestic demand. Domestic demand justified factory investment, and factory investment drove down costs. Lower costs expanded the market further. The loop was deliberate. By the early 2010s, China had become the world's dominant manufacturer of solar panels. By the mid-2010s, wind turbines. By the late 2010s, lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles. This is the phase most Western analysis focuses on and often frames as an unfair competition. The characterization is not entirely wrong. State-backed loans, land subsidies, below-market electricity for factories, and tolerance for overcapacity allowed Chinese manufacturers to price international competitors out of solar and wind hardware markets at a speed that had no precedent. But the framing misses something structurally important. The manufacturing build-out was not separate from the domestic energy transition. It was the mechanism through which the domestic transition became economically viable. Cost curves in solar and wind fell globally because Chinese factories drove down input costs. The technology had existed before. The financing and planning frameworks existed in various forms in Germany, Denmark, and the US. What China added was the manufacturing scale that converted an expensive niche technology into a commodity. By 2024, China produced over 80% of the world's solar panels, wind turbines, and energy storage batteries. That share was not achieved by accident. It was the output of a 20-year policy loop connecting subsidies to domestic deployment, to manufacturing, to export. What was different then compared to now? The primary question was how much capacity could be built and at what cost. The answer to that question has essentially been settled. The primary question now is different. By end 2025, China had installed more than 1.8 terawatts of wind and solar capacity. A terawatt is 1 million watts, a unit of scale that was not commonly used in discussions of renewable energy a decade ago because no single country was anywhere near it. China crossed it, then kept going. The 15th five-year plan, covering 2026 through 2030, reflects a system that has moved beyond the deployment question. The language in the plan is notable for what it emphasizes, not just adding more capacity, but integrating what already exists and building the infrastructure to make it usable. The plan targets 420 gigawatts of long-distance transmission capacity, including power corridors running from large wind and solar bases in China's western deserts to coastal demand centers in the east. In other words, think of it as building a national grid-scale plumbing system for electricity that is generated far from where it is consumed. The generation is largely in place. The pipes are the constraint. The plan also frames non-fossil energy reaching roughly 25% of primary energy by 2030 and sets a carbon intensity target, CO2 emissions per unit of GDP of 17% lower by 2030 compared with 2025 levels. And embedded in the National Energy Administration's guidance, not prominently in the headline targets but visible in the technical annexes, is an implied goal. More than 3.6 terawatts of wind and solar alone by 2035, and roughly 4,700 gigawatts of total non-fossil capacity. That would be approximately double today's level in a decade. The support architecture that underpins this is also changing. The era of blanket feed-in tariffs, the guaranteed purchase prices that drove Phase 1, is ending. From mid-2025, new projects are expected to compete through market-based bidding rather than receiving fixed state-set prices. That is a meaningful structural shift. It introduces revenue discipline and forces project developers to account for actual grid conditions, curtailment risk, and storage costs rather than relying on the price floor. The NDRC, China's National Development and Reform Commission, the body that sets macroeconomic and energy targets, is rolling back direct subsidies while maintaining support through grid access priority, storage incentives, and demand-side electrification programs. EV charging infrastructure, green industrial parks, data centers, co-located with renewables, green shipping corridors. The incentive is shifting from build it and subsidize it to build it and create a market for it. This capacity expansion does not occur in a vacuum. It is explicitly tethered to the domestic coal infrastructure, and the coal picture is the part of the 15th FYP, 5-year plan, that draws the most critical external commentary. The plan explicitly allows coal to continue to play a role during 2026 to 2030. The framing is upgrade and retrofit existing plants, use them as flexible backup for the grid during periods of low wind and solar output, and manage the transition rather than cut abruptly. China is also still permitting and building new coal capacity in some regions, a fact that sits awkwardly alongside the investment and deployment figures cited earlier. The energy security logic is not obscure. China's grid cannot yet operate reliably at high renewable penetration without substantial storage and flexible backup capacity. Coal plants, particularly in northern and western provinces, serve as the system's shock absorber. They ramp up when wind drops or solar dims, and they keep the lights on during demand peaks that batteries cannot yet cover at scale. The question this raises is whether the coal backup is a transitional feature, something that phases out as storage and grid infrastructure catch up, or a structural feature that keeps China's emissions trajectory on a slower path than the renewable deployment figures imply. The honest answer is that both are possible, and the plan does not fully resolve which. What it does suggest is that the 2030 to 2035 window, when the transmission corridors are supposed to be built, storage is supposed to scale, and the non-fossil capacity is supposed to double, is the period when the coal backup either starts to shrink or entrenches. Three things could cause the current arc to diverge from its implied trajectory. First, grid and storage build-out falling behind capacity additions. China has been adding generation capacity faster than the transmission and the storage infrastructure for several years. Curtailment, renewable electricity that is generated but cannot be delivered to consumers because the grid lacks the capacity to carry it, has been a persistent problem in wind-rich northern regions. The 15th FYP's emphasis on 420 gigawatts of transmission is a direct response to this. If that build-out lags, the utilization economics of new wind and solar projects deteriorate, slowing private investment regardless of policy intent. Second, the subsidy transition introducing more friction than expected. The shift from guaranteed feed-in tariffs to competitive bidding is appropriate for a mature industry, but it removes the predictable revenue floor that made financing straightforward. More critically, it exposes project developers to a phenomenon known as price cannibalization. Because solar and wind assets generate power concurrently based on weather patterns, they flood the spot market at the exact same time. Without massive, expensive storage buffers, this coincident generation drives merchant electricity prices towards zero during peak production hours, cannibalizing the project's own internal rate of return. The risk to the 2035 system bet isn't a lack of industrial capacity. It is a structural margin compression that makes unsubsidized merchant capital walk away. The NDRC is attempting to mitigate this with capacity payments and long-term power purchase agreements. But the transition is an active execution risk whose full impact on investment cadence is not yet visible. Third, coal retrofit economics proving stickier than planned. Retrofitting coal plants for flexible operation, ramping them up and down to complement variable renewables is technically feasible but expensive. Plant operators have limited incentive to invest in flexibility if their primary revenue comes from running at high capacity. If the market and the regulatory signals are not strong enough to shift that incentive, coal plants run more steadily than the system needs them to, crowding out renewable dispatch and slowing the integration that the plan assumes. None of these three risks makes the 2035 target unreachable, but each has the potential to push the timeline, change the economics of the non-Chinese parts of the global renewables supply chain, and alter how quickly China's domestic energy mix actually decarbonizes relative to its capacity additions. Reuters reported in March 2026 that investors have been bidding up Chinese green energy stocks since the Iran war, treating Middle East risk and Hormuz closure as demand catalysts for Chinese solar, wind, and storage, both domestically and in export markets. That is a reasonable short-term read. The long-term read requires watching the system, not just the capacity. Now, here are the three markers to track. First, annual additions versus the 120 gigawatt per year wind and solar guidance for 2026 to 2030. The NEA has signaled at least 120 gigawatts per year of combined wind and solar additions, including 15 gigawatts per year of offshore wind. Offshore wind is the more technically demanding and capital-intensive part of the target. It requires specialized installation vessels, subsea cabling, and grid connection infrastructure that the onshore wind and ground-mounted solar do not. Whether offshore additions actually hit the stated pace is a meaningful signal about whether the system is moving toward the higher complexity, higher value end of the transition. The second marker, the transmission corridor build-out. The 420 gigawatt long-distance transmission target is the infrastructure commitment that makes everything else in the plan coherent. High-voltage direct current lines running from Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Gansu to coastal load centers are long lead time, high capital projects. Progress or delay on these corridors will be visible in NDRC permitting data and NEA annual reports. Tracking them gives the system-level read that capacity addition figures alone cannot provide. And the third marker, China's renewables export position under trade friction. China's dominance in solar, wind, and battery manufacturing makes it the primary global supplier for the energy transition happening outside its borders. Tariffs, trade disputes, and the supply chain diversification efforts by the US and EU are all applying pressure to that position. How Chinese manufacturers respond through pricing, through overseas factory investment, through technology licensing will shape both the pace of global transition and the economics of the domestic industry that has been a major driver of cost reduction over the past decade. The arc from 2005 Renewable Energy Law to $940 billion of annual clean energy investment and 1.8 terawatts of installed capacity is not a story that was obvious at the start. It was built through a policy loop, subsidies to deployment, to manufacturing, to cost reduction, to further deployment, that compounded over 2 decades. The 15th five-year plan marks a transition in what that loop is now optimizing for. Not how many panels and turbines can be produced and installed, but whether the grid, storage, and the transmission infrastructure can make them into a functioning system. The 2035 implied targets more than 3.6 terawatts of wind and solar, roughly 4,700 gigawatts of total non-fossil capacity, are ambitious on paper. Whether they are achievable depends on whether the system integration challenge is solved at the place the plan assumes. The coal question does not go away on the plan's timeline. The subsidy transition introduces execution risk, and the geopolitical context, Iran war, Hormuz disruption, US-China trade friction is adding both urgency and complexity simultaneously. What is not in doubt is the scale of the commitment. $940 billion in a single year, more than half of global renewable additions, a plan that implicitly doubles non-fossil capacity in a decade. Whether the system catches up to the capacity is what 2026 to 2035 will actually test. This has been the China Memo. Thank you for listening. A standing note before I go. Nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice, a recommendation to buy or sell any asset, or a view on any specific company or security. The China Memo is an analytical briefing. All figures and assessments are drawn from publicly available sources.